Justin, first, welcome to the Advisor Lab. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I know first, you're obviously a former athlete. You went to UCLA. I think we're really peers. I went to Syracuse. I graduated in '94. And, my wife, we both were communication majors. She started out wanting to be in sports and entertainment. She actually interviewed Jim Boeheim way back when. And of course, we had some great basketball teams in those days, and obviously huge sports fans. Maybe just talk a little bit what drew you to focusing on athletes through your financial professional career.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me, Derek. Looking forward to the conversation. In terms of what drew me to working with athletes, I was I would say a college baseball player, but I didn't actually get to play all that much at the collegiate level. So I learned pretty quickly that my career in sports was not going to happen on the field. And I went to work in college for some sports agents and got some exposure working with athletes in the agent capacity, and realized that that wasn't necessarily the path I wanted to pursue. But I learned pretty quickly that most of the professionals that I was coming in contact with had advanced degrees of one type or another. And recognizing that a history degree from UCLA wasn't going to open a ton of doors for me in the sports marketplace, I pivoted to law school. And I thought that, that would be a good educational background to have for any type of business I decided to pursue. So while I was in law school, while most of my friends and peers were doing the traditional law school interviews with law firms, I had a very atypical approach, and I was looking for jobs that were in the sports marketplace. And I stumbled upon a company that was one of the early RIAs with a focus on the sports business, and I was fortunate enough to start working there. And I remember after my first day on the job coming home and calling my parents and saying, I had figured out what I want to do with my career. It was kind of a perfect blend of, working in sports, working in business, working in finance, the law degree being helpful, and then, of course, having a lot of interpersonal contact because I like working with people. And so I quickly learned that, this niche of working as a financial advisor in the sports industry existed. And this was 30 years ago. Today, it's much more prevalent. But back then, it wasn't as obvious of a path at the time.
Mm-hmm. And so you've worked with athletes and people in entertainment and so forth, but you've also had clients that are not in that area. And these are everyday individuals that have any number of different professions. Is there something that really stands out in your mind, like the big difference between how you work with these athletes as opposed to just traditional wealth management clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a couple things that come to mind right off the bat. I think, first of all, when you're working with athletes, you have a situation where you're dealing with sudden wealth, and it is tremendous, it is quick, and most often you're dealing with clients that don't have either practical experience or education or family, experience working with tremendous wealth. So there's a vast array of issues that arise, but, the most important part of that leads to kind of really focusing financial literacy and educating the clients. As one. I think the second thing that's critical to consider in that context is that your usual professional or high net worth client might work 30 or 40 years with, a 20 or 30-year retirement horizon. And so you have a lot of time to work through a plan, and they're saving for a shorter amount of time. Whereas professional athletes, if they're lucky and have good careers, might work 8 or 10, maybe 12 years if they're lucky. And then at that point, leaving aside the fact that they may pursue other jobs or other paths after, but you could be looking at a retirement time frame of closer to 60 or 70 years. And so you have a much shorter earning window to prepare for a much longer retirement period. And so there are some critical distinctions about how you would approach one versus the other.
People often talk about this wave of opportunity, right? That's been created for younger athletes. Like we're even talking kids in high school. My daughter is going into her junior year. She's been playing travel volleyball, and we're going on a trip down to Florida to do a camp or something in a few weeks. And we've seen these kids, and they're doing all these videos and Instagram and all this. I mean, you can talk about how much social media has changed the game and allowed even the biggest athletes like LeBron James or whomever to engage with clients. But I guess just when you deal with athletes that have this enormous opportunity so early, how difficult is that to manage, especially when you're dealing with the parents, right? Because they're still very involved. And you think back to Tiger Woods. I was just watching 2000 Tiger special, and can't imagine like what it would have been like if he was going through that today. Um, just curious on your thoughts around that. How do you deal with that as someone who's a manager? You're a therapist. You're a financial advisor. It's got to be super challenging.
The quick answer is yes. There were about 6 different questions or paths I could take from there. So I'll go in one direction, and you can redirect me if you want me to focus on one of the other parts. But in terms of how do you work with very young athletes, particularly as they're getting younger with NIL, I think it all starts with education. I think the most important thing is to help these young athletes understand that they need to have a team of professionals around them. And of course, the size of that team and the breadth of that team may vary. It's if you have a $5 million NIL prospect, that person is probably going to need a bit more and frankly be able to afford a bit more in terms of professional services. In contrast to, the punter on the team that's getting paid $50,000. But the key is really starting early on, educating on, what are you making after you're getting paid this amount? What does that really mean to you in terms of net? Because you have to understand how taxes work. Because you're presumably a 1099 recipient, there's going to be self-employment income as well. So you're considering all kinds of different state, federal self-employment taxes. So how much money is there? Do you have good tax planning? What are you going to do with that money? Are you going to invest it or spend it? What is your investment plan and how are you going to be able to accomplish that? So all of these things come back to, again, as I often talk about, educating the client and then surrounding them with the right team so that they understand, the things that they don't know. What we do is not necessarily rocket science, but there is a level of experience that comes with having done this for 30 years where we bring to the clients issues that may or may not arise or things that they need to prepare for that they may not even be thinking about. So again, for the higher level talent, do you need to think about disability insurance or are there other considerations? Do you need to create an entity of some type? Is there a retirement plan that you can take advantage of? So there's a number of these different issues, but it really starts with education and getting the right team around the client. And then if you want me to talk about social media in general, let me know. I can certainly talk a little bit about that and how that's changed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, how do you help them to interact with it and do the right things? Like, it's an art, isn't it? And you have to be smart about what you post, how you do it, how often. Like, do you help athletes with that part of it? Is that part of the infrastructure of the business that you provide? And I mean, that would be interesting to hear sort of your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think there's a different couple components there. I think that, some athletes might have their agents providing them with guidance on social media. Some might have their school compliance departments providing best practices. Again, some of the top level talent might have media consultants. And then from my perspective as an advisor, I certainly have that come up as well. So there's a number of people that can be advising, but you raise a good point that it can create a lot of pitfalls. And in my 30 years of working in the sports industry, there have kind of been a couple of what I would call sea change events in terms of how we see the athletes' financial lives evolving. And social media is one of those because it's a double-edged sword, obviously, whether you're an athlete or anybody, right? It's like when we were growing up, you could do something stupid and then you would move on to the next thing and, that was that. But today, if anybody does anything stupid, it gets posted online, it's there forever. And so from an athlete's perspective, the benefits of social media, right, are that you have an immediate ability to have tremendous reach to an audience. So you can create and cultivate your true authentic self, and you can really tell your own story. And whether that's through your day-to-day activities or brands you associate with, or causes you support, there's an ability to really demonstrate that authenticity, which is wonderful. The flip side, however, is that, like I said, you can make a mistake, which can really harm you forever. And similarly, there are no gatekeepers in terms of interaction with others, right? And so it's very easy for anybody to get behind a computer screen and start talking negatively about you, talking to the athlete. And, athletes are people too. Everybody has feelings. Some people are able to be thicker skinned than others, but you want to be really careful about kind of getting into a war of words, because that can damage your credibility, that can damage your reputation. It can do a whole host of things that negatively impact your marketability off the court or field, and maybe even a team's interest in signing you or recruiting you. So there's a lot of good that has come from it, but there's also a lot of pitfalls that athletes need to be aware of.
When it comes to building an athlete's brand and thinking about the short-term monetary gains you can have from signing up with any company to sell this or that versus sort of sticking to whatever your long-term branding strategy is, like, can you talk about some examples where you've tried to help athletes balance that? Where they're like, hey, I could get X if I just do this, and they're like, yeah, but it long term isn't maybe going to fit with what we're thinking. And is there situations where you were able to structure a deal where maybe someone took a piece of the back end as opposed to taking the cash, and it really made more sense? Because I think that's where our athletes probably sometimes don't make the right decisions, and folks like you are there to kind of help them with that.
Yeah, as I referenced a couple of minutes ago, there have been a couple sea change events in my space. One of them is the evolution of social media. And you just hit on a second one, which is kind of the nature of endorsements. And so when I started in this business 30 years ago, a successful athlete would go out and get a sneaker deal, a card deal, a beverage deal, and you kind of had your 5 typical brands, and each athlete would align with a company, and it was very transactional in nature. And to the point you just made, and this is where the social media piece ties into it, today athletes are much more sophisticated investors and much more understanding of how much control they have over their brand. So they are able to go out and enter into agreements, not as transactional in nature, but as business opportunities, where they actually align with the brand. So for example, I have a particular client that, liked a particular water rehydration product. And, he was drinking it and enjoying it and using it because he believed in the product. And, the company approached him and said, hey, would you like to invest in our product or our company? And he said, I do really like the product. I do support it, but, I don't want to just invest in it. I actually want to become a brand ambassador. I want to put my money into the deal. I want to put my name into the deal. And then I want to help you grow the brand because I truly believe in it. And so we actually did, in that case, effectively negotiate a deal for him whereby he invested some money. He became an ambassador to the brand, and he also took a board seat. And so that's very different than the approach 30 years ago when Nike came to the same person and said, we'll pay you X $100,000 a year to wear Nike shoes. And you're seeing that, across the board. And I think, LeBron James, while not a client of mine, is like the prime example of, probably today's most successful athlete entrepreneur from, modern times. I mean, I think Magic Johnson and Shaq and these guys were the trendsetters, but, LeBron James has done deals with Beats by Dre, and he took ownership in that. And then, of course, they had a deal when Apple acquired them, and he made a tremendous return, and he created Blaze Pizza. And so, he's done all these things, in Hollywood, creating his production company. And so what we're seeing today is all of these athletes realizing that, these relationships don't need to be transactional in nature. And in fact, there's much more upside for them if they forego some money on the front end, by taking a piece of the company. And so there's a lot more of that going on today.
Is the athlete's ceiling, I mean, that must have a big impact on kind of how you think about planning for them. Like if like yourself, you played some college baseball, but maybe you knew I'm not going to have the game to go to the next level. You have clients that are super successful. Maybe they're getting opportunities to monetize that, but the professional career is maybe not realistic. Do you plan differently? I mean, do you try to talk to them about that? Like, look, at you have a really small window where we should try and do every deal we can, or, does that come up, or is it not really kind of part of how you deal with athletes?
Well, I think the way that I would think about that, it's funny. I will bring up retirement to a client when I'm recruiting this client at 18 years old. And that sounds crazy, right? Because most people haven't even started a career at 18. And, when I talk about retirement, I actually don't like to use that word. I like to talk about a transition from one chapter to the next. So, if we're talking about a collegiate athlete, for example, it may be that you are a great college basketball player, but, you're never going to make it at the next level. And so if you're thinking about what you want to do in the next chapter today, you're going to much better position yourself to find success. And so by way of example, if you are playing for Kentucky basketball and even if you're the 12th man on the team, any Kentucky booster or any Kentucky alum is going to be really excited to talk to you, to meet you, to try and be helpful to you. And if you're thinking about what comes next because maybe the NBA is not on, in the cards for you, you can pick up the phone and call the CEO of anybody who is a Kentucky alum and say, hey, look, I'd really love to pick your brain because I'm interested in real estate, or I'm interested in venture capital, or I'm interested in, pick whatever the profession is. I'd love to pick your brain to figure out how you got to where you are. Maybe there's an opportunity for an internship. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to just learn from you and you can give me advice. But the reality is, for an athlete, his or her celebrity is never going to be greater than when that particular person is at the height of his or her career. And so if you are thinking about the future today while you're playing, it's going to open a whole lot more doors to you. And those doors may not be doors that you care to pursue for 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road if you're fortunate enough to make it to the next level. But the reality is the vast majority of the people aren't going to. And so, that's one thing. Definitely just thinking about next steps, next chapters, and how can I best position myself while taking advantage of the position I'm in today. And that's at the collegiate level. But even at the professional level, it's the same idea. Most athletes' careers end earlier than they would like, either because of an injury or, a younger, more talented, perhaps cheaper teammate coming along and beating them out. And suddenly, they find themselves at a retirement before they were ready for it. And so I find it incumbent upon myself to really emphasize to my clients and people that I work with how important it is to be thinking about retirement early on. And that's aside from any of the financial planning that you'll be doing, because there's a whole life ahead of you and there's a next chapter ahead of you.
I got two questions, but before I forget this one, like, as an example, let's say you get an 18-year-old kid. He gets drafted by a Major League Baseball team. They give him $3-4 million. He's going to go play single A ball, and they'll see if he makes it.
Yep.
And he's not coming from a lot of money. His parents are, just like most of America. They're not sitting there with 5-10 million in their 401k. Can you talk about how do you invest that money? Like, how do you think of, what do you tell them to do? Is that stay in short-term money market? We don't know what's going to happen in 2-3 years. Do you put some of that in stocks? Like, how do you think about that?
Sure. I think as a starting point, we talk about you're getting paid $4 million. What does that really mean? $4 million is a gross payment from which you're going to pay taxes. And again, just for easy numbers, let's say that's 50% of it. And then from that, you have agent fees of, let's call it 2 or 3%, whatever it may be. And then you have a couple of expenses that you're going to have to take care of. But when it's said and done, you're making $4 million, which means you're going to net, let's call it 1.7. So if you have $1.7 million, what do we do with it? And most kids at 18, I know certainly I would have thought, if I'm making $1.7 million, I want to go buy all these things. And so, what I try and do is explain to them that we have to operate on the assumption that this is going to be the only contract you ever get. With good luck and good fortune, maybe you get another one. And if and when that happens, we have another conversation and we revisit. But for our purposes today, we have $1.7 million to work with. And if you're 18 years old, then we want to put that money to work for you in a conservative but meaningful way. And so it would start with things like basic stocks and bonds. Blue chip stocks could be ETFs, really, low cost, risk correlated assets that you believe will be good long-term investments. You want to start though with that. And once you have a foundation built, if you're lucky enough, I'd always analogize investing to my clients like the pyramids in Egypt. And I say, I first ask them, I say, do you know why the pyramids in Egypt have lasted so long? And, sometimes they get it right. Most of the time I get a stared eye, a blank eye. I say, the reason why the Egypts have lasted so long in Egypt is because they were built on a solid foundation. And if we make that analogy to your investment philosophy, your foundation is blue chip stocks, bonds, and cash. And that is what you need to start with. That's where you need to have a sufficient amount of that so that you will always be safe. You can have, protection against market upturns and downturns. And the reality is there will be market, ups and downs. But if you're in good companies for the long haul, over time, here's what the chart looks like from the last 100 years of investing.
Mhm.
And, it's a slow but steady race. It's not a marathon. And then you get into more detailed conversations about, the power of time and, the magic, the miracle of compounding interest, and helping them understand that by putting that money to work for them early and letting it sit and work for them, it's going to grow over time at a meaningful rate, as long as it's invested in a prudent and wise way. But, that's kind of the general approach. I mean, I would talk to the specific client and dig a bit deeper about, if there's any particular things that he or she is particularly interested in. But I think what I would caution them against doing is rushing out to make a lot of illiquid investments. We all know that we see Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and all these NBA players in the news every day for this company that they invested in and that company. And those guys can afford to take those risks because if you go back to my pyramid of wealth, their foundation is certainly secure and they've worked their way up to the point at the top where you can afford to take a bit more risk for a higher rate of return. Does that make sense?
It does, and that's a good transition here, because I was thinking about, let's talk about those athletes that are on the wealthier side. They've got big contracts. They've got a lot of excess money they need to invest. Now, I know MAI is partnered with iCapital, so obviously you have a platform there where you can do a lot of alternatives and things like that. But when you get these clients that are really wealthy and they're investing in businesses, they're doing their own clothing line, maybe they're doing crypto exchange, and I mean, these are all examples of alternative investing, right? Anything outside of stocks, bonds, and cash.
Mm-hmm.
So do you recommend other types of, like, doing funds, like secondary funds and private equity, private credit, things like that? Is that part of your belief system when it comes to the financial advisor side with those type of clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the financial advisor side, my job is to help educate clients on options, appreciate the risks and potential upside, and then give them as much information as possible so they can make an informed decision. At the end of the day, I tell them, it's your money. You're going to make the final decision. I'm going to tell you exactly what I think about it. I'm not here to be a yes man. I'm here to give you the facts and then let you make a decision. So when it comes to the world of alternatives, that is absolutely an area within which we operate quite a bit. Again, the younger clients, we tell them, hey, the time's not right. They might bring a deal that's actually a great deal. I mean, the vast majority of them are not great deals, but you might see a great deal and it just may be the wrong time. And you have to explain to the client why, you can't afford to put $100,000 at risk today because your net worth is 1 million and you can't put 10% at risk when you don't have any guaranteed earnings. That would be an imprudent decision on your part.
Right. And Justin, do you have to do that a lot? Like, they bring
All
you
the time.
these investments and you have to vet them and due diligence them and go through the
Yes.
memorandum and then like that's just part of what you do for them?
That's part of what we do. As a big picture, we are providing investment advisory services where we provide a holistic approach to all things that are financial related in the client's life. And it even goes beyond that because we offer a very broad suite of family office services. So anything that touches a dollar sign or impacts a client's business or financial life is going to come across my desk.
Hmm.
And so, and then there's the therapist part too, as you mentioned earlier. But, so yeah, we get deal flow all the time. Deals come in. We will, myself or my team will do an evaluation of it, provide a due diligence memorandum to the client. And then I'll come back and I'll either say, this is horrible for all these reasons, run as quickly as you can, or this is an interesting opportunity and here are the risks associated with it, but here are the reasons why it's actually legitimate. And good company, good numbers, good operating team, founders are smart, blah, blah, blah. And if you want to take a risk, here are the things to consider, but you need to appreciate the risk associated. And then there's the middle ground, which is, I've read through this. I don't love it, but there are not any red flags that jump out today. I wouldn't put my own money into this. I would advise you against doing it. But if it's something you really want to do, then let's talk about maybe reducing the allocation so we take some of the risk off the table. But just know going in that there's a high likelihood that this will not succeed. And so those are different conversations with different people at different times. And so yes, we deal with that every single day, but we don't have a cookie cutter approach to that because every situation is going to be unique. Every client's financial situation, time horizon, even spending, right? So one client might be able to take more risk than another just because that client's been a better saver through the years. And one deal that doesn't make sense for one client might be perfectly reasonable for another.
Now, you've been working with athletes for 25, 30 years.
I hate to admit that because I realize how old I am now, but yes.
I know. But it is kind of a cool number too, even though it does mean you're old. But so your client book, would you say it's balanced between folks that are on the verge of transitioning to retirement or retirement from their careers versus folks that are really in the early stages? Like, what's that balance like? And I guess the second part of it would be, what is that? What are the challenges with someone who is like, look, you're at the end. Like, here's how we need to think about things. Is that more difficult than the athlete who's, in the early stages, high school, college, going to pro?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, I would say that with respect to my book of business on the athlete side, I have a nice balance where I would say maybe a third of those clients are actually retired. And I've been with these clients literally for 25 or 30 years, from their rookie deals through their entire careers into retirement. They're now financially secure and successful. And to me, those are the great success stories. Those are the stories that I love to highlight when I'm pitching new business because it means that I did something right. I wasn't the reason for their success. Their ability to perform on the field or on the court was certainly the major driver, and some good luck and health along the way. But we had a financial plan in place that enabled them to get from point A to point B and now live in retirement and live a wonderful life. So I have a number of those clients, and those are great clients. I have a number of clients that are veterans in the respective leagues, ranging from kind of been in the league for a couple years to a particular client that I know is heading into his final season after a very long and storied basketball career, right? And then I also have, some young rookies and even a couple of college kids that I'm helping in NIL. And in fact, have also dealt with some high school age kids, believe it or not, over the last year or two with this whole NIL evolution. So in terms of a balance within the book of business, you want to stay relevant. You always want to replace as guys are moving on to bring in some younger talent. And then, there is an element of luck for those people to stick. I mean, I can think of some guys that I've worked with from your alma mater, some of whom had great careers and others, unfortunately, were kind of in and out of the league pretty quickly. But you just never know. So, what I want to look for is a client who, first and foremost, is a good person who's willing to listen and has an upside. And if they're willing to learn and have an upside, then I'm willing to, work with you, and we'll see if this works over time. So I guess that answered your first question. In terms of the second question, how do you approach one versus the other?
What's more challenging? Is one more challenging than the other? Like, I would guess the early career one's more difficult, just because there's a lot of teaching them, feeling it out, working with the parents, working with all these other new members of their team versus someone who you've been working with for a long time. And now it's like, okay, how do we make sure this money lasts?
That's a great question. And the answer is one that I will tell people whenever they ask me about my job, which is people are people. And so there is not one answer. I might have a young client who has no experience. That client may or may not have family members involved. And that particular client may be really challenging because they don't know anything. They want to spend everything. Maybe the parents want to get paid a whole lot more quickly now that the child has made it. And there are a ton of struggles and challenges with that. I may have another client from the same draft class with an entirely different situation. And that particular client just comes in and says, tell me what I need to do so that I don't end up being a statistic. And that client, by his or her very nature, might be really frugal. And I mean, I have one of my retired clients that I think about now, who's one of the great success stories. And I remember laughing, this was years ago, but he signed a 6-year, $60 million NBA contract. And at the time, that's when like 10 million a year was a lot of money, right? Today, that's less than average. But I remember this particular client calling me, from Best Buy one day saying, is it okay if I buy a TV? And I'm like, yeah, how much is it? He said, it's $1,000. And I said, you don't need to check with me on that. I mean, absolutely. Yes, you can. But you know what? I'm glad that you're asking, and I'm glad you're being thoughtful about it. And that's wonderful. And this is a client, again, that may be part of why he's one of the success stories, because he's been thoughtful from the entire process. Now, so there's not one easier or more difficult. Let's compare that to retired clients. I have worked with some clients that have made a ton of money in the NBA. And one of the biggest challenges is, and again, going back to the educational component, I tell my clients, you need to create a reasonable but sustainable budget. And this has to be something that is going to be able to sustain into your retirement. And when you're out there making $20 million a year, the idea of spending a couple $1,000,000 a year may not be that crazy. It happens. But when that particular client's career is approaching an end and there's not another contract in sight, I'm having talks with these clients years before we get there, but I'm saying, hey, look, we need to start really making sure that your lifestyle is sustainable. I know you've gotten accustomed to living a certain way, and I know you want to continue to do that. But if you don't rein in the spending, you're never going to be able to do that. You'll retire and your portfolio might last you for 5, 10, maybe even 20 years, depending on the situation. But, here's what it looks like. And I will literally prepare, a graph, and I'll show them, here's your burn rate. Here's the number of years. And if you continue at this path, you're going to run out of money in this year. And then let's show you, 2 other hypotheticals on that same chart. If we get you down from 2 million a year to 1 million, what does that look like? If we get you down to 500,000, what does that look like? If we assume a reasonable rate of return and, blah, blah, blah along the way. And, showing them that chart should be powerful. What I will tell you from experience is that kind of lesson proves to be very powerful with some. And unfortunately, I've seen other clients that just never were able to change their ways. And so to me, in some ways, that veteran who is not able to adjust his lifestyle in a meaningful way is a lot harder to deal with than the younger client, because there might be 10 or 20 years of goodwill built up in working with this family. And I know the family. I've been at the wedding. I have seen the kids grow from, babies to adults. And I'm sitting here telling the client, like, hey, if you don't change your ways, you're not going to make it. But there's only so much I can do. I can give you all the data, all the information, all the charts in the world. But at the end of the day, this comes down to one thing, and that is the one thing you can control, your spending. So again, I don't think it's easier or harder to deal with one segment as opposed to another in general. I just think people are people, and you have to take each situation as it comes.
On a personal level, you mentioned that, when you're sitting down with prospective clients, obviously you're going to talk about examples of clients you have where you've had great success. And I'm sure if you're talking to, the number one high school tennis player in the country, he or she's going to want to hear about your biggest client and all the great deals you got them, and look at this empire I helped them build. This is what I do at MAI. And that's natural, right? You're trying to bring in a client, and that's probably what a young person wants to hear. But from your perspective, is your most gratifying experience in your position that type of situation? Or is it like the high school player we talked about who maybe doesn't really end up having a career, but you did the right things or helped them and turn that 1.7 into something that was allowing them to become a lawyer or an entrepreneur? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
where do you get the most fulfillment? Because you're doing a lot of great things, but there's a lot of folks that can waste it away and make 100 million, or there's people who only get 3 or 4 or 5, and you know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I would say that gratification is derived in a number of different ways. And fortunately, my experience isn't just having that happen in one way. So, I think about, one of my most successful clients who has enjoyed some of the most success on the court and off the court and financially, and he is building a business empire. He's in a number of great deals. And for all those reasons, I have a tremendous amount of gratification, and he's appreciative of everything I've done to help him get there. And we are more than, it's more than a business relationship, right? And so tremendous gratification from there. I have also had guys or women along the way who haven't made as much, but ended up being the absolute best savers I've had. And I can think of a client now who played in the NBA for a number of years and had a nice career, but he was never somebody that was able to get to the big contract. So he was always kind of, if not a minimum earning player, on the lower tier. But he did so well with his money. He was such a smart guy, and he just always asked the best questions. And we would engage in dialogue about all kinds of things, finance and business and life related. And now he remains a very good client of mine. And although he never made that much, he probably saved, if I'm thinking about just net savings compared to overall earnings, he's probably one of the best savers I've ever worked with. And this is a person that will go on, to work somewhere in the engineering world because he is a brilliant mind and just also happened to be extremely tall and really good at basketball. But, I derive tremendous pleasure and gratitude from that. But I think the one that I'll come back to that might be the most gratifying for two different reasons is a client that I worked with as a rookie in the NBA. And we laugh that when I would call him in his first 2 years, he would see the incoming call and he would put me to voicemail. And he would say, I knew anytime you were calling me, you were just calling to tell me I was spending too much money. And I said, well, because you were. And he said, yeah, but I didn't want you to tell me that. I knew that. So fast forward, this player had a very nice career in the NBA and did all right for himself, but has gone on to coaching and is now one of the most successful coaches in the NBA. He's won a championship. He's been around for several years, and he made more money in his first coaching contract than he ever did in his entire NBA career. And he's had the good fortune and signed several contracts thereafter. So he's actually made a very nice amount of money through the NBA and continues to. And there are two reasons why this story sticks out for me specifically. Number one, we laugh about the fact that all he ever wanted to do was ignore me before. And now today we have really meaningful conversations about business and investing and finance. And we just sit around together laughing, like, look at how far we've come. And to me, that's one of the most fulfilling reasons doing my job. Secondarily, the same client has always been a very, very generous person and cares a lot about community. And it has always been his long-term goal to provide philanthropic. He wanted to do something for his hometown in a philanthropic manner. And for years, we did little things here and there, sponsoring events and putting on things. It could be coat drives or fireworks shows for 4th of July, whatever it was. But as he has attained greater success and greater wealth, we've been able to establish a plan where we have a much more meaningful, long-term, sustainable approach to philanthropy and doing good in the community. And, I'm really happy about the fact that like what we're working on now has resulted in literally multi-millions of dollars being raised from federal grants and being committed to the cause. And he has effectively, started to rehabilitate this tiny small town that he is from. And I know for a fact that nothing brings him greater joy than what he's been able to do in his hometown. So again, success is measured in a number of different ways, and the gratification I get from working with my clients manifests in a number of different ways. But it's reasons like that where I keep doing what I do because it is fulfilling.
Yeah, that's a great story. It's always so nice to hear about people who accumulate a lot of wealth and success and put it back in the community. What's one piece of advice you would give to any client, regardless of their status?
Well, I would say something I guess I said earlier, but I'll repeat, but investing is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And you need to be patient and have a game plan. And particularly as an athlete, you have a game plan going into any game you're going to play. So, those are good analogies that work. But, you have to be appreciative of the fact that it's a long-term game plan. And the get rich quick schemes don't work. Anyone who promises you something that sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true because it's either a lie or illegal. In either case, you don't want to mess with it. And I guess the other thing I would say to tell anybody, particularly an athlete, is always pay yourself first. And by that, what I mean is any client that I work with, when we sit down and we start creating their budget from the outset, and I don't care if you're making 500,000, 5 million, or 50 million, we are always going to sit down and create a budget and have short-term and long-term goals. And when I say pay yourself first, what I say is, you need to invest in yourself in your long-term from day one. And just like we have a monthly mortgage payment or a monthly car payment, we're going to have a monthly payment that we're going to treat like a bill. But what we're really doing is sweeping money from your bill pay account to your investment account. And I don't care how little or much that is, but we're going to do it on an ongoing basis because we want to get into the right financial habits from day one. And if you're paying yourself first and you're consistently doing it, then you're always putting money aside for yourself. And as your income increases, the amount you're putting away increases. So I think those are, two critical lessons that are universally applicable.
Well, Justin, I really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been extremely, extremely educational, and I'm sure our audience is going to love it. I wish you more and more success and with MAI, and we hope to have you back on the show soon.
Thanks so much for the time, Derek. Appreciate it.
This video is for informational purposes only and should not be considered or relied upon as investment advice. It may not be copied, quoted, or referenced without Cion Investments' prior written consent. Do not rely upon any opinions, predictions, or forward-looking statements contained herein. The views expressed do not constitute an offer to sell or a solicitation to purchase securities, nor do they constitute the endorsement of a particular asset class or investment strategy. Neither Cion Investments nor its affiliates and/or subsidiaries warrants its completeness or accuracy. Certain information contained in this video may constitute forward-looking statements that may be inherently unreliable, and actual events or results may differ materially from those reflected or contemplated herein. Cion Investments expressly disclaims any obligation or undertaking to update or revise any information included herein. The views expressed by the guests or participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Scion Investments LLC or any of its subsidiaries, officers, or staff. Please be aware of the real risk of loss in following any investment strategy. No investment strategy or asset class referenced herein is intended to be construed as investment advice. You should make an independent, informed decision regarding any investments or strategies only after reviewing all relevant offering or disclosure documentation with your financial professional, and after considering your objectives, risk tolerance, and best interest before making any investment in any financial product. Registered personnel should review any business development initiatives addressed herein with their respective compliance and legal departments. Coverage of such topics should not be construed as compliance or legal advice. It is at the discretion of each respective firm if such practices are consistent with firm policies and procedures.